Something happened quietly, almost invisibly, and that's exactly why it matters. On December 1st, 2025, while most people were busy with work, bills, and everyday life, the Federal Reserve made a small technical decision that barely made headlines. No breaking news, no urgent alerts, no one explaining why you should care. And if you heard about it at all, it probably sounded like bureaucratic noise, the kind of thing that lives far away from your real life. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This decision is going to shape how your money behaves for years, whether you're paying rent, saving cash, buying a home, or just trying to stay afloat. The dangerous part isn't what the Fed did. It's that most people never realize when these shifts happen, only when the consequences show up later in higher prices, tighter budgets, and a quiet feeling that you're working just as hard, but somehow falling behind. The last time a move like this happened, millions of people didn't lose money overnight. They lost it slowly, invisibly, without ever understanding why. And by the time they noticed, the wealth gap had already widened. This isn't about panic. It's about awareness. Because once you see how these moments work, you can never unsee them. To understand why this quiet decision matters, you first need to understand who's actually running the game. The Federal Reserve isn't a villain, and it isn't a hero either. It doesn't wake up every morning thinking about your savings account or your grocery bill. The Fed exists to stabilize the system, not to protect individual outcomes. And that distinction is everything. When people say the Fed works for the public, what they really mean is that the Fed works to keep the financial engine from stalling, banks functioning, credit flowing, markets not collapsing. In their world, stability means preventing shockwaves that could take down the entire economy. But here's the part that's rarely said out loud. When the system is the priority, individuals become secondary. If stabilizing the system means asset prices rise faster than wages, that's considered acceptable. If it means inflation quietly erodes purchasing power, that's considered collateral damage. This isn't corruption or conspiracy, it's incentives. The people making these decisions are trained to think in terms of balance sheets, liquidity, and systemic risk, not rent increases or grocery prices. And once you understand that, a lot of confusing outcomes suddenly make sense. The Fed isn't trying to make you richer or poorer. It's trying to keep the machine running. And the machine has rules that most people are never taught. Once you know who controls the machine, the next step is understanding how that machine actually moves money. Think of the economy like a massive system of pipes rather than piles of cash sitting somewhere. Money flows. It doesn't just sit still. When the Federal Reserve changes policy, it's not pressing a button that says make people richer or make people poorer. It's adjusting pressure inside the system, and pressure determines where money flows first. When the Fed makes borrowing cheaper, money moves fast. Businesses take loans, investors chase returns, asset prices respond almost immediately, stocks rise, real estate climbs. Anyone already positioned inside that flow feels richer, often without doing anything differently. But when the Fed tightens, when borrowing becomes expensive and liquidity dries up, that same system slows down. Spending pulls back, hiring cools, risk disappears. And the people who live paycheck to paycheck feel the impact long before markets do. This is why inflation feels so confusing to most people. The dollar amount in your bank account doesn't change, but what that dollar can buy quietly shrinks. Groceries cost more, rent edges higher, gas jumps, and it feels personal, even though it's mechanical. The Fed often explains this process in technical language, but the reality is simple. Money enters the system at the top and works its way down. Assets react first, wages react last. That delay is where the wealth gap expands, not because people made bad choices, but because the system rewards positioning over effort. Once you see this, the question stops being, why is everything getting more expensive? And becomes, where is the money flowing before it reaches me? If this all sounds abstract, it helps to look at the last time this exact pattern played out, because it wasn't that long ago. In early 2020, when the world froze and fear took over, the Federal Reserve stepped in aggressively. Rates were slashed. Liquidity flooded the system. Trillions of dollars were created to keep markets from collapsing. On the surface, it worked. The financial system survived. Businesses stayed alive. Panic was contained. But beneath that stability, something else was happening. Asset prices began to surge at a pace most people had never seen before. The stock market rebounded with shocking speed. Home prices exploded. Anyone who owned stocks, real estate, or businesses watched their net worth rise, even as the broader economy struggled. Meanwhile, people who didn't own assets experienced the same period very differently. Their paychecks didn't rise overnight. Their savings didn't magically compound. Instead, prices crept higher, rent increased, essentials cost more, and by the time wages began to adjust, the gap had already widened. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the predictable result of how money enters the system. The benefits moved fast to the top, while the costs filtered down slowly. And the most important detail is this: none of it felt dramatic in the moment. There was no single day where people realized they were falling behind. It happened gradually, quietly, until the difference became impossible to ignore. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes. And once you recognize the rhyme, you start to hear it everywhere. This is where the story stops being about policy and starts being about inequality, because the gap doesn't grow by accident. When money becomes cheap and abundant, it doesn't spread evenly across society. It concentrates. Asset owners see gains almost immediately because markets price in future expectations faster than real life can adjust. Stocks move in seconds. Real estate reprices in months, but wages move in years. Employers don't double salaries overnight just because inflation is rising. Raises are negotiated slowly, cautiously, often after the damage is already done. That lag is where people lose ground without realizing it. On paper, they're still employed, they're still saving, they're still doing everything they were told was responsible. But in reality, their purchasing power is slipping. This creates what economists call a K-shaped recovery, but you don't need a chart to feel it. One group watches their net worth climb, while another group feels like they're running on a treadmill that's slowly speeding up. And here's the uncomfortable part. The system doesn't consider this a failure. From a policy perspective, rising asset prices are a sign of success. Markets are stable, confidence is high. But stability at the top doesn't feel like stability at the bottom. It feels like pressure. And over time, that pressure builds frustration, confusion, and a quiet sense that the rules must have changed, even if no one ever told you they did. This is the moment where macroeconomic theory turns into something painfully personal. Picture two people with similar incomes, similar ages, and similar work ethic, both trying to do what they were told was right. One keeps money mostly in cash, proud of building a safety net, watching the balance grow slowly but steadily. The other takes that same money and puts it into broad market assets, not chasing hype, not gambling, just participating in the system as it exists. A few years pass. On the surface, nothing dramatic happens. No sudden windfalls, no obvious mistakes. But when you zoom out, the difference is impossible to ignore. One person feels squeezed, confused about why life keeps getting more expensive despite doing everything responsibly. The other feels relief, not because they worked harder, but because their money was positioned where the system rewards growth first. This is the cruel part most people don't talk about. The system doesn't punish laziness. It punishes misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding isn't random. Most people are never taught how monetary cycles actually work. They're taught to save, to be careful, to wait. And in a stable world, that advice makes sense. But in a system driven by liquidity, timing, and asset inflation, that same advice can quietly work against you. The pain doesn't come from a single bad decision. It comes from following rules that no longer fit the environment you're living in. Looking ahead doesn't require prediction. It requires pattern recognition. You don't need to guess exact numbers or time the market to understand what usually happens when liquidity starts loosening again. When borrowing becomes easier, spending follows. When spending rises, prices respond. And when prices rise faster than incomes, the pressure lands on the same people it always does. This isn't about fear or forecasting disaster. It's about preparation. The signals right now aren't dramatic, but they're familiar. Growth is slowing. Hiring is softer. Debt levels are high. And historically, when those conditions appear, policy tends to lean towards support rather than restraint. Support feels good at first. Markets stabilize. Confidence returns. But beneath that calm surface, the same dynamics quietly restart. Assets respond first. Cash falls behind. Wages lag. And the people who don't adjust their positioning feel like the ground is slowly shifting under their feet. The mistake most people make at this stage isn't denial, it's passivity. They wait for clarity. They wait for certainty. But clarity always arrives after the opportunity has passed. The goal isn't to be early or perfect. It's simply to not be caught unaware again. This is where many deeply held beliefs start to quietly fall apart. For years, cash has felt safe because it's tangible, visible, and emotionally comforting. You can see the number. You can touch the account. It feels stable. But feeling safe and being safe are not the same thing, especially in an environment shaped by inflation and monetary cycles. When prices rise faster than interest on savings, cash doesn't just sit there. It slowly decays. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough each year that your purchasing power slips without triggering alarm bells. This is why inflation is often called a silent tax. There's no bill, no notification, just a gradual loss that most people only notice in hindsight. And the hardest part is psychological. Cash gives you certainty today, while investing introduces uncertainty tomorrow. The human brain prefers certainty, even when it's mathematically worse. That instinct made sense in a different economic era. In today's system, it can quietly work against you. This isn't about reckless risk-taking or abandoning caution. It's about recognizing that safety has changed shape. Holding cash feels responsible, but in the wrong context, it can become the riskiest choice of all. This is the part where most people expect a dramatic solution, and instead, the answer is almost disappointingly simple. You don't need insider knowledge. You don't need perfect timing. And you definitely don't need to be rich. What matters most is participation. Getting your money out of a state where it's guaranteed to lose purchasing power and into assets that, over time, have historically grown faster than inflation. That doesn't mean betting everything or abandoning caution. It means starting small, staying consistent, and letting time do the heavy lifting. For many people, that looks like broad, low-cost index funds tied to the overall market. Not because they're exciting, but because they work. The goal isn't to beat the system. It's to stop being quietly penalized by it. This shift isn't about greed. It's about self-defense, about acknowledging the environment you're in and responding accordingly. Waiting until you feel completely confident is the trap, because confidence usually arrives after prices have already moved. Momentum matters more than perfection. Even small, regular steps change your trajectory over years. And once you start, something important happens, psychologically. You stop feeling like things are just happening to you. You regain a sense of control. Understanding the game doesn't mean you suddenly control it, but it does mean it stops controlling you. The system isn't fair, but it is consistent. It rewards assets, time, and positioning, and it quietly punishes passivity and misunderstanding. Once you see that, the confusion fades. Rising prices stop feeling random. Market rallies stop feeling disconnected from real life, and the frustration many people feel starts to make sense. You realize this was never about working harder or being smarter. It was about knowing which side of the flow you were standing on. You don't need to outsmart the Federal Reserve. You just need to stop pretending cash is neutral. In an environment where money is constantly being reshaped, standing still is a decision, whether you mean it to be or not. The last time this cycle played out, people who owned assets pulled ahead quietly while everyone else wondered what went wrong. This time, at least, you've been paying attention. You know what's happening. You know why it's happening. And that awareness alone changes your outcome. You don't need to rush. You don't need to panic. But you do need to move with intention, because the faucet is opening again. And when it does, the same forces will be set in motion. The difference now is that you're not watching from the outside. You understand the game, and that understanding is the only real advantage that still exists.